Today I wanted to talk a little bit about old video games. I think games, regardless of their age, are fully legitimate pieces of human culture, even the ones that I personally hate. They're art, and therefore they should be preserved and treated with respect. I think old games are not worse than new games, they're just different. They're targeting different things. In general, I think old games are every bit as valid and as good as new games. But unfortunately, I think this is kind of a radical view. It seems to me that any game that was made more than a decade or so ago is treated in a certain, very different way than games released in the last 5 years or so are. To be clear, I'm not saying that I don't myself treat older games differently too. Video games are such an industry, so tied up in commerce, and I think there's just really strong messaging telling us that the new games are the good and valuable games. Old games that were once $60 when they came out are now sold at a massive discount, routinely for $5, $10. Video game stores such as GameStop don't even sell games that are more than 10 years old. You have to go to like a specialty shop to even buy any older games. More broadly, marketers always want us to have the new thing and think that the old thing is bad because they make money selling us the new thing. We're invited to think about games as products rather than art, so that they're kind of like an engineering project that gets new and improved every year. Games were 8-bit, and then they were 16-bit, and then they were CD-based. And we sort of tend to blend the technological progression element of the technology with the value of the art itself. And this is what marketers want. Games all offer different things to different people. So let's talk, as an example, let's talk about shoot 'em ups. So let's compare Galaga with Gradius. Is Galaga worse than Gradius? So I think growing up, I definitely would have said yes. The default assumption is you can move around in 2 axes in Gradius instead of 1. There's more power-ups, the art has more colors, and for these reasons, it's a better game. But what I've also observed over the years, particularly as a game designer, is that almost everything you change about a game might improve or add something about the game, but it also simultaneously almost always harms or removes something else about the game. And that something else might have been something really valuable to some players. So in the case of comparing Galaga to Gradius, adding a second axis on the movement does not just make the game better. There's something to Galaga as a one-axis game that really is lost when you add that second axis. I personally actually much prefer the simpler movement in Galaga. I found it a lot more fun to play without that second axis. I think that maybe what I like about it is that it's easier to focus on the aiming aspect, whereas when you have 2 axes, you have to think a lot more about dodging and moving in a very specific way. But it's also just a different feeling. One of these approaches is not objectively better than the other, and if you prefer Gradius, that's definitely valid, but it's also equally valid to prefer Galaga. And it's worth noting that by default, you're told that you should value Gradius over Galaga, Ikaruga over Gradius, and Vampire Survivors over Ikaruga. The newer is always better. And this is true across all of video game history. The oldest RPGs out there, like let's take the earliest Ultima games. These are not actually worse than, say, Final Fantasy VII Remake. The one valid aspect to valuing new games over older games is just that the language of video games does change over time. So in order for a player in 2024 to really get the value of, say, Ultima 1, there will be an adjustment and learning period, and one that is different than the learning period that you experienced in 2020 when 7 Remake came out, if you played that game. With Remake, you're learning rules, sure, but you understand pretty much all of the meta rules, i.e. what does a button look like on screen? What is the overall experience of play going to be like? What button means yes on the controller, and so on. With Ultima 2, you're not just learning the rules of Ultima 1, you're also sort of learning a different language of how interactive software is engaged with at that time, at the same time. And not just that, but you're also being challenged to learn a completely different vision of how video games could be fun. These days, video games are mostly meant to be fun because you're seeing elaborate cutscenes with voice acting, you're seeing high-resolution visual effects going off in real-time kinetic action environment, at least a lot of the time. There's collection and there's relatively low risk that you'll just get brick walled at any moment. All of the information that's needed to play a new game is usually inside the application itself these days in the form of an interactive tutorial. And then there's also an element of just a different political and social environment that is going to leave a mark on games of any era. So back in Ultima 1's day, there was a different, not worse, just different approach to games. A lot of information that was important was in the manual, and it was also very often useful to take notes or draw maps on paper. I have to say that I'm just really, really tired of this old idea that Ultima 1 was really just trying to be Final Fantasy VII Remake or Baldur's Gate 3, and it would have if they had the technology to do it. That's not true, and I think it's a harmful way to think about games. Ultima 1 was trying to be Ultima 1, or at least something like Ultima 1. There was a developing language of video games back then, and the designer was trying to express a vision in that language. And we still have a developing language of video games now. It's not like the language of video games ever stops developing. If you want to, you could sit down with Ultima 1 right now and go and learn its language. It will be challenging and uncomfortable at first, but you can do it. It's also very understandable to not want to invest that labor. But at the very least, I know that it is a real, valid piece of culture, every bit as valid as your favorite video game from the past decade. I think that part of us moving toward having a healthy, vibrant culture of video games and video game development is going to include acknowledging the real value of games, not as products to be consumed and then discarded, but as important cultural artifacts that do not lose their value over time. Thanks for listening. Also, one last thing I must tell you about. I have a Kickstarter right now for a new exciting card game. Been working on it for almost 3 years. It's really cool. It has very cool asymmetric characters, and I just did a video about some of the game design things in that game, and that, you know, game design theory things that I've implemented into the game and used to build the game. But anyways, thank you for listening, and please go check out that Kickstarter and spread the word. Talk to you soon.